There comes a moment in everyone's life where the weight of betrayal, rejection, or deep disappointment pushes you into silence. You retreat. You go quiet. Not because you're weak, but because your soul is healing. Maybe it's a friend, a partner, a boss, or someone you trusted, didn't expect you to pause. But more importantly, he didn't expect you to stay silent. Because your silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. It was self-respect. It was the sound of boundaries being built in peace. They thought your voice was gone. They thought the damage was permanent. But what they didn't realize is the silence was never about giving up. It was about gathering power. The world may have forgotten what you're capable of, but you haven't. Too often, people associate silence with surrender, with backing down or giving up. But let's be clear, silence is not always a sign of weakness. In fact, sometimes it is the most powerful thing you can offer in a world obsessed with noise. When someone hurts you, betrays you, or underestimates you, the most immediate reaction most people expect is confrontation. They expect words, arguments, drama, or retaliation. They expect you to explain yourself, to defend your worth, to plead your case. But there's a different kind of strength in choosing not to react, in choosing instead to go inward. You see, silence takes discipline. It takes self-awareness to recognize that not everything and everyone deserves access to your energy, that not every situation requires a reaction, that sometimes the greatest form of resistance is to hold your peace, not because you don't have something to say, but because you value yourself enough to wait until you're centered before you speak again. Some people fear silence because it exposes truth. It forces them to sit with what they did or what they failed to see in you. Your silence can speak louder than 1,000 angry words. It can echo in the minds of those who expected you to break and remind them that real strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it says nothing at all. There is a kind of silence that isn't passive. It's purposeful. It's the pause before the transformation, the stillness before the breakthrough. It's a boundary drawn without explanation. And in that quiet space, you're not falling apart. You're coming together. Because in the moments when you say nothing, you're actually saying everything. You're saying, I don't owe you my pain. I don't owe you my energy. I'm choosing me now. Disappointment doesn't always show up as tears or anger. Sometimes it shows up as silence, as pulling back, as becoming quieter in rooms you used to light up, or losing the urge to explain yourself in conversations where you once felt seen. Disappointment isn't always loud. Often, it's subtle. It's in the shift of your tone, the heaviness of your breath, the absence of your presence. When someone you trusted lets you down, when they don't show up for you the way you showed up for them, it changes something inside you. It shakes a foundation. And sometimes, instead of fighting to hold that foundation up, you quietly step away from it. Not because you don't care, but because caring too deeply and being hurt because of it takes a toll on your soul. You start to ask yourself, was I too available? Was I too forgiving? Did I overextend myself, hoping they would see me the way I saw them? Withdrawal doesn't always mean you're done, but it often means you're tired. Tired of being misunderstood, tired of giving more than you get, tired of being expected to carry emotions that others refuse to acknowledge or reciprocate. That kind of tired lives deep in the spirit. And when you feel it, the most natural response is to pull away to protect your peace in whatever way you can. But here's the thing, that withdrawal, it's a survival move. It's a sacred pause. You step back not because you're bitter, but Because you're building. You're figuring out how to love yourself without relying on the approval or presence of people who only valued you when it was convenient for them. Disappointment draws a line in your life, a before and after. Before, you were open, trusting, maybe even a little naive. But after the disappointment, you become guarded, not out of malice, but out of necessity. You learn to observe more, to speak less, to protect the parts of you that once felt so easy to give away. And maybe no one notices the moment you begin to disappear from the conversations, from the places, from the dynamics that once held your heart. But you notice, you feel the difference. You feel the weight of knowing that someone you counted on, counted you out. And that pain doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just quietly closes the door. People love to create their own narratives when you go quiet. They assume you're lost, confused, broken, bitter, or worse, that you're irrelevant. But what they often fail to understand is that your silence wasn't some accidental retreat. It wasn't a breakdown, a glitch, or a sign of defeat. Your silence was a conscious, deliberate decision, a move made not out of fear, but out of clarity. Because sometimes the best thing you can do for your own sanity is to step back and protect your energy from spaces that no longer deserve it. When you've been constantly over-explaining yourself, constantly defending your worth, constantly proving that your heart was in the right place, there comes a moment when the most powerful thing you can do is stop. Just stop explaining. Stop proving. Stop pouring into people and places that only take from you. The silence wasn't random. It came after the last conversation that didn't go anywhere. After the last effort that wasn't appreciated. After the last time you bent until it hurt. It came when you realized your peace was worth more than being understood by those who were never listening to begin with. You chose to stop speaking because you were tired of repeating yourself to people who only heard what they wanted. You chose to stop showing up in rooms where your presence was taken for granted. You chose silence because it gave you back something the noise never could: perspective. In the quiet, you started to hear your own thoughts again. You started to feel your own emotions instead of carrying the weight of everyone else's. You remembered who you were before the chaos. And it's funny, the moment you go silent, people suddenly start to wonder what's wrong with you. They notice your absence more than they ever acknowledged your presence. But the truth is, they were never paying attention to your soul. They only noticed the sound of your support, your encouragement, your help, the things you gave so freely. Now that you've taken that back, now that you've stepped into intentional silence, they mistake it for distance or coldness. But in reality, you're not being cold. You're being careful. Careful with your time. Careful with your words. Careful with how much of yourself you're willing to give. Because silence isn't weakness. It's wisdom. It's choosing to protect your peace rather than beg for someone to respect it. They thought you were done. They thought the silence was permanent, that the chapter had closed on your fire, your voice, your potential. They mistook your pause for your finale. But what they didn't realize is you weren't disappearing, you were recalibrating. See, some people are only comfortable with you when you're predictable, when they feel like they've got you figured out. As long as you stay in the box they put you in, the role you've always played, the version of you that served their comfort, they're fine. But the moment you go quiet, the moment you stop showing up the way you used to, the moment you stop giving them that version of you they relied on, they get nervous. Because deep down, They never expected you to grow in your absence. They didn't expect you to use the silence as soil. They never considered that while they were ignoring you, overlooking you, or writing you off, you were evolving. You were healing. You were strategizing. You were becoming. They assumed you needed their approval to rise again. They thought their distance or disinterest would crush your confidence. But they failed to understand that the strength you're building now doesn't come from their validation. It comes from your resilience. Your ability to sit in the quiet with your broken pieces and start putting them back together on your own. They expected you to crawl back, to explain yourself, to ask for space in places that once rejected you. But this time is different. You're not coming back for permission. You're coming back with purpose. And that scares people, because nothing is more dangerous to someone who took you for granted than watching you remember your worth. They counted you out because they didn't understand that your silence was your training ground. They didn't know that the version of you returning is not the one that left. And now that you're walking back into your life with boundaries, clarity, and strength, the same people who once doubted you won't know how to handle you. Your comeback was never meant to be loud. It was meant to be undeniable. Not built on revenge, but on restoration. Not to prove them wrong, but to prove to yourself that you never needed them to be right. There's something sacred about the silence. The way it strips away distractions and forces you to sit with yourself. It's not glamorous. It's not loud. It's not the kind of growth people clap for on social media. It's quiet, raw, and deeply personal. But in that quiet, that's where real power begins to rise. People often assume that strength is forged in the spotlight, in the applause, in the wins, in the moments everyone can see. But that kind of strength can be shallow, easily shaken when things go quiet. Real power, lasting power, is rebuilt when no one's watching, in the stillness of your pain, in the silence of your isolation, in the dark, where your only company is your own reflection, your doubts, and the truth you can't run from anymore. It's in that quiet where you begin to realize what you've been carrying. The burdens, the guilt, the expectations, the stories you've told yourself about who you are and who you're not. And slowly, as the noise fades, you start to put those things down. You start letting go of the need to please, to perform, to prove. And in that letting go, you start remembering yourself. The version of you before the pressure, before the pain, before the world told you to shrink. That's where your power begins to rebuild. Not in reaction, but in recognition. You recognize your worth without needing to shout it. You reclaim your time, your peace, your presence, and you do it quietly, steadily. You don't broadcast your healing process because it's not for show. It's for survival. It's for transformation. The quiet becomes your classroom. It teaches you patience. It teaches you discipline. It teaches you that some battles are won by choosing not to fight at all. It teaches you that healing is not linear and strength doesn't always look like hustle. Sometimes it looks like rest. Sometimes it looks like deleting the number. Sometimes it looks like saying nothing and choosing yourself instead. And while the world sleeps on you, while they assume your silence means surrender, you're building something they can't see: fortitude, clarity, resilience. These aren't things you shout about. They are things you become, because the strongest people don't always walk back into the world with noise. They return with presence. The kind of presence that comes from sitting in the storm and learning how to breathe again. It's a common assumption that life's blows will break you, that the silence means you've faded, that your retreat marks your ruin. But what they don't see is what's really happening behind the scenes. You're not shrinking. You're not folding. You're refining. You're rebuilding. You're reclaiming every part of yourself that was buried under the pressure to be palatable. You're coming back, yes, but not the same. Not quieter just to keep the peace. Not smaller to make others more comfortable. Not with your light dimmed to protect their pride. No, you're coming back stronger, wiser, sharper, rooted in a truth that no longer bends for temporary validation. Because the version of you that went silent was tired. Tired of carrying the weight of everyone's expectations while your own needs sat quietly in the background. Tired of proving your worth to people who only saw you through the lens of their convenience. Tired of showing up for others when no one showed up for you in the same way. But the version of you returning, that version learned. That version healed. That version found strength in stillness, clarity in confusion, and peace in solitude. You didn't go into hiding, you went into healing. And now, you don't just know your worth, you embody it. You don't demand space, you take it. And not out of pride, but out of purpose. You no longer chase what drains you. You no longer over-explain to people committed to misunderstanding you. You no longer silence yourself in places where your truth deserves to be spoken. And the strength you carry now, it isn't loud or forceful. It's quiet but firm. Gentle but immovable. The kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself because it's woven into everything you are. And yes, they may notice the shift. They may call you distant, cold, changed. But the truth is, you are changed. You had to be. Because the you that once tolerated what broke your spirit could never survive where you're headed next. Growth doesn't always look like blooming. Sometimes it looks like outgrowing the soil you once fit in. There's a major shift that happens when you've been silent long enough to hear yourself clearly again. At first, the silence feels strange, like something is missing. You're so used to explaining yourself, defending yourself, proving your heart, proving your intentions. But after a while, you realize this silence isn't empty. It's full of truth, full of answers, full of power. When you finally choose to speak again, it's not because you're desperate to be heard. It's not because you need to convince anyone of your worth or beg for understanding. You speak because you want to, not because you have to. And that shift changes everything. Before, your voice may have been reactive. You spoke to be accepted, to feel safe, to be seen. You over-communicated in hopes that someone, anyone, would meet you halfway. You used words to try to fix what could only be healed with space. But that was before you understood the weight of your own presence, even in silence. Now, your words are intentional. You don't speak to fill the air. You speak to move things. You speak from a place of knowing, not needing. You've learned that not everyone deserves access to your voice, that your piece is not up for debate. That being silent was never about fear. It was about resetting your relationship with your own power. You speak now with a different tone, not louder, but deeper, not rushed, but rooted. You no longer talk over yourself just to keep someone else comfortable. You don't explain your boundaries in essays. You don't argue to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. You don't waste breath where it isn't valued. And the people who once felt entitled to your voice, the ones who expected constant access to your energy, your forgiveness, your explanations, they might feel the distance now, but that distance is your protection, not your punishment. Your silence taught you that presence isn't owed, it's earned. And your voice, it's not on autopilot anymore. It's sacred. It's selective. You know now that words carry weight. And yours are no longer cheap. You don't need to convince anyone of who you are. You know who you are. So when you speak again, it won't be to chase connection. It'll be to honor your truth. They thought your silence was the end of your story. But really, it was just the beginning of your return to yourself. What looked like absence on the outside was actually realignment on the inside. You weren't vanishing. You were resetting. And not just your schedule, your surroundings, or your social circle. You were resetting your soul, because life has a way of pulling you in 100 different directions. Expectations, responsibilities, relationships, distractions. All of it can cause you to drift away from your center without even noticing. One day you look up and realize you've been functioning on autopilot, showing up for everyone but yourself, surviving instead of living. That's when the silence comes. That's when your spirit says, pause. And you listen. Not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. You step back. You get still. You clear the noise, not just around you, but within you. You stop explaining. You stop reacting. You stop chasing things that leave you feeling empty. And in that stillness, you begin to feel the shift. You start to hear your own thoughts again, not the voices of those who told you who you were supposed to be. You begin to question the roles you were cast in. You begin to reclaim your choices. Silence becomes your sanctuary. It becomes the space where you can finally breathe without judgment, cry without apology, dream without interruption. It's where you reconnect with the version of you that existed before the world told you to shrink, before the heartbreak, before the betrayal, before the exhaustion. And as you sit in that silence, something sacred starts to happen. You begin shedding, not just habits, but identities. You begin deleting things that used to define you. The need to explain, the pressure to please, the fear of being misunderstood. You let go of the timelines you thought you had to follow. You release the weight of unspoken expectations. You reset your rhythm. This silence, it wasn't punishment. It was permission. It gave you room to rest without guilt, to reevaluate without chaos, to dream without distraction. And most importantly, it gave you space to choose you again. Not the version of you shaped by survival, but the one rooted in self, respect, clarity, and calm power. It was the moment you stopped pouring into empty places and started protecting your power. It was the shift from seeking to knowing, from explaining to choosing, from reacting to rising. You didn't owe the world a loud return. You owed yourself a real one, and now you speak when it matters. You show up where it counts. You walk with the kind of presence that only comes from having once been invisible. And the people who expected you to fade, they're the ones watching now, wondering how someone they counted out found the strength to rebuild in the dark. But you know the truth. You didn't disappear. You reset. And now you're back, not to be seen, but to be whole.